Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 35th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Last time, Phasael and Herod, the sons of Antipater the Idumean, the Roman-appointed governor of Judea, lured their father's assassin to his death in the Phoenician city of Tyre. They had done so with the blessing of Cassius, the assassin of Caesar, who had come east to raise money and troops for his looming confrontation with the Caesarian faction. That party was led by Mark Antony, general and distant cousin of Julius Caesar, and Octavian, who was the obscure maternal grandnephew of Caesar and who had, shockingly, been posthumously adopted as the dictator's son and heir. Cassius left town in 43 BC, having bled the provinces dry of men, materiel, and money. He marched west for the confrontation with the Caesarians. His departure removed the heft of Roman military might from Judea and opened something of a power vacuum. Hyrcanus had remained as high priest of the Jews and ethnarch of Judea, but he had long been seen as weak and vacillating, variously accused of being a puppet of Antipater or the Romans or both. Plenty of people wanted to see him gone, waiting for their opportunity to make a move. The fear of Rome's intervention always muted such schemes, but with Antipater gone and the Romans away fighting yet another civil war, the timing for agitators to act was perfect. By 42 BCE, Hyrcanus' brother and adversary Aristobulus had been dead for 7 years, having been poisoned to prevent his re-entrance into Judean politics following his captivity in Rome. Just as Phasael and Herod had sought revenge when their father had been assassinated, so too did Aristobulus' younger son, Antigonus. After his father had been killed, Antigonus pleaded with Caesar to intervene, claiming that Hyrcanus was a usurper, requesting that his side of the family be restored to power. Opting to stick with Antipater, the guy that had brought an army of 13,000 to Alexandria in Caesar's hour of need, he refused. But in 42 BCE, Caesar was dead, and Cassius had left to go confront the Caesarians in Greece. Things didn't go great for Cassius and his band of liberators. On 42 BCE, Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide after their armies were defeated by Antony and Octavius at the Battle of Philippi. In a fun historical detail, Philippi had been founded, named by, and in honor of Philip II of Macedon, father to our old friend Alexander the Great. All the onerous taxation and troop levies that Cassius had foisted upon the eastern territories had done nothing to prevent his defeat at the hands of the Caesarians. This development posed something of a dilemma for Herod. He had been an ally to Sextus Caesar, but then switched to support Cassius when Cassius had been the main Roman in the area. How would the Romans, now in charge, view Herod? Friend or foe? While this question loomed large for Herod, he faced a more immediate and dire threat. Antigonus, that meddlesome son of Aristobulus, had long resented his uncle Hyrcanus for his subservience to and collaboration with Rome. You may remember that Aristobulus and Hyrcanus were brothers, the descendants of the king and high priest Alexander Jannaeus, and his wife, their mother, Queen Alexandra Salome. Their family, the mighty Hasmoneans, were the dynasty founded in the flames of the Maccabean rebellion that had overthrown the Seleucids. The Hasmoneans were proud and stubbornly independent. They'd heroically fought for Judean autonomy, and Antigonus, descended as he was from this mighty royal house, seethed over his uncle's meek supplication to Rome. Overthrowing tyrannical foreign oppressors was in his blood. Antipater, long believed to be the devious power behind the scenes, was dead, but his sons Phasael and Herod were still in their governorships and still brutally suppressing Judean dissent in order to maintain the favor of Rome. Antigonus seethed. Phasael and Herod were definitely not Hasmoneans. In 42 BCE, with Cassius and his fellow conspirators dead, the various factions made their way to Mark Antony to plead their case, each seeking to be granted the right to rule by the triumphant Roman general. Much to Antigonus's dismay, Antony sided with Herod, Phasael, and Hyrcanus, opting for continuity and stability. The legacy of the Hasmonean family mattered little to Antony. Hyrcanus was confirmed in his role as high priest and ethnarch, and the brothers were to continue as governors in an official position called tetrarch. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but this muddled, tripartite division of power with one ethnarch and two tetrarchs is one Herod himself will come back to a long, long way down the road. Furious at having been outmaneuvered, Antigonus hastily organized an army and marched on Judea, bent on displacing his uncle and the brothers Phasael and Herod. Herod sprung into action. By now experienced in leading troops, he easily brushed aside his would-be rival and put Antigonus to flight. For this victory, Herod was much lauded. Perhaps the Judeans had grown weary of incessant conflict, and while Hyrcanus might be weak, his young governor was strong, resolved, and clearly a man on the rise. But Herod, about 30 years old at this point, felt an insecurity arise out of this victory over Antigonus. Herod's adversary had organized his campaign on the basis of his Hasmonean lineage, a legitimacy that Herod could never hope to claim for himself. He was, after all, the son of an Idumean, an advisor to a king, but not a king in his own right, and certainly not descended from the mighty Maccabees. Given that his family members were recently converted to Judaism, and forcibly at that, Herod struggled to be seen as part of the Judean nobility, no matter what his official status. Feeble though Antigonus's attempted seizure of power may have been, Herod felt that it exposed a big weakness. He needed to strengthen his own position. He needed to link himself to the Hasmoneans to forge a tighter connection to Judea's heroic past. True to form, when he acted, he did so quickly and decisively. Herod, never shy from a bold course of action, dismissed his wife, Doris, and their young son, Antipater. He didn't remain a bachelor for long, though, as he planned to wed again, securing a betrothal to a Hasmonean princess, Mariamne, who brought with her impeccable royal credentials. The contest for control of Judea had been fought for 2.5 decades by the rival factions of the brothers Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. The rivalry was more than political, it was theological as well. Aristobulus allied himself with the Sadducees, a sect of Judaism involved in religious, social, and political affairs, and one that favored the upper crust of Judean society. Hyrcanus both supported and was supported by the Pharisees, a rival sect that drew its connection not from the nobility but from the common man. The antipathy that the two groups felt toward one another was deep, highly suspicious, and a fault line that ran through Judean society. Now, this is not a religious podcast, so I'm going to avoid a discussion on the theological differences between the two groups and skip entirely other factions of Judean society, such as the Essenes, but it's important to know that these factions existed and that they more or less despised one another. And for our purposes, remember that the rivalry between the brothers Aristobulus and Hyrcanus had found expression in the ongoing feud between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Mariamne, new bride-to-be of the ascendant Herod, was descended from both factions. Her parents were first cousins. Her father was Aristobulus' eldest son, and her mother was Hyrcanus' daughter. In Mariamne, the two competing factions were merged. She was a true Hasmonean, a Maccabee, and now she was to be Herod's bride. But for Herod, the match was more than simply political. In time, Mariamne would come to be renowned for her beauty and her razor-sharp mind, and Herod would grow to be fanatically devoted to her, to the point of obsession. At the time of their betrothal, however, the young princess was just that, young, only 14 or so years old at the time. It would be a few years before she was of marriageable age. The official wedding would have to wait, but scoring Mariamne was a big coup for Herod. For their part, the Romans were happy to have a measure of peace and stability in Judea. It was always a minor part of their empire. They didn't care much about the claims of the rival factions. They just wanted a strong hand to keep things steady so that they could stay focused elsewhere. Antony had undertaken a vast reorganization of the eastern provinces, and the last thing he wanted was a festering conflict in what was, to Roman consideration, a minor backwater. Judea mattered a lot more to the Judeans than it did to the Romans. Antigonus, son of Aristobulus, uncle to Herod's new bride-to-be, dedicated Sadducean, might have had his attempted seizure of Judah thwarted by Herod, but he was not so easily deterred. Just like his father before him, Antigonus was fanatically driven to rid Judea of his uncle Hyrcanus and the Roman lackeys Phasael and Herod. Rome wanted none of it. All Rome wanted was a quiet and stable region, and in the current regime, they had found it. The brothers were eager partners in this project, and so they enjoyed the full backing of Rome. If he couldn't get support from Rome for his cause, then maybe Antigonus could sway Rome's most bitter rival into his corner. Following his defeat at the hands of Herod in 42 BCE, Antigonus made his way to Parthia. The Parthians were the successors to the Seleucids and in the Achaemenids, as the rulers of what we now think of as the Persian Empire. They were an ascendant force, and the only empire that could rival Rome. We've met them before. It was the Parthians that obliterated Crassus, an event that shattered the tenuous bonds of the First Triumvirate, which set in motion the events that led to Caesar's crossing the Rubicon and set Rome down the road to civil war. Antigonus pleaded his case to the Parthians, and they offered him their backing. It probably didn't hurt that he offered massive amounts of treasure to help sway them to his cause. The Parthians signed on to the project of putting Antigonus onto the Judean throne, contributing troops, generals, and equipment. In 40 BCE, the combined forces of Antigonus and Parthia swept into Judea. Hyrcanus, Phasael, and Herod were invited to peace talks with a Parthian commander. Sensing a trap, Herod urged Hyrcanus and Phasael to spur the meeting, but they neglected this advice. Those two were seized and imprisoned, but Herod managed to slip through their grasp and make his escape. He made sure his bride-to-be, Mariamne, was safe behind the walls of the stronghold of Masada, then fled away from the danger. There was only one place he could go: Rome. As he made his way west, Antigonus vented his fury on his uncle by biting his ears off, mutilating Hyrcanus, and thus rendering him ritually unclean and unfit for the high priesthood. Phasael avoided the humiliation of punishment at the hands of his rival, content knowing that his brother had escaped and would seek vengeance on behalf of the family. Phasael committed suicide in a gruesome manner. While in prison, he managed to bash out his brains, likely by smashing his head against the hard stone walls of the prison to which he'd been confined. The disfigured Hyrcanus was then sent into exile in Babylon, where he lived among the Babylonian Jews, the long-standing community that dated all the way back to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian captivity more than half a millennia earlier. In 40 BCE, Antony, furious at their incursion into Roman holdings, mobilized his forces and drove the Parthians out of Roman territory, but Judea was still in the hands of Antigonus, who claimed the throne by virtue of his Hasmonean lineage. In the same year, 40 BCE, Herod arrived in Rome. A lot had changed in the capital over the last few years. The fallout from the Civil War had seen the conspirators obliterated. Antony and Octavian, and a third partner of almost comical insignificance named Lepidus, had formed what is now known as the Second Triumvirate. Side note, friends, if you remember, back in the Pompey episodes, we talked about a brief revolt following the death of Sulla, where a couple of schemers tried to seize the state for themselves. It was Pompey who organized the response, crushed the scheme, and saved the Republic. It was the father of this Lepidus who led that revolt, which ultimately ended in Dad's defeat and death. Now, son was part of the Second Triumvirate, the lesser partner to be sure, but at least he was in the inner circle. This partnership had formed a few years earlier, in 43 BCE. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus had kicked off their agreement with a Sullan-style proscription, posting the names of the condemned in the forum for their lives and their property to be forfeit. Once again, the streets of Rome had run red with blood as countless enemies were liquidated in the mass purge. By the time Herod had arrived, the triumvirs had settled old scores, including sanctioning the murder of the great orator and statesman Cicero, and dividing the empire between themselves. Herod's father had been a Pompeian client, but then deftly navigated himself into Caesar's camp. Herod first been an ally of Sextus Caesar, then of Cassius, now Antony. Just like his father, Herod had been able to ride the turbulent waters of Roman political discord and keep his head just above water. Herod had always been able to engage with this Roman or that, one-on-one in private conversation. Now, in Rome, he presented himself to the assembled Senate en masse, the scions of Rome's noble families and wealthiest social climbers. Hundreds of these elite Roman citizens gathered to hear what Herod had to say. Playing the role of humble supplicant, Herod dressed in simple clothes and implored for Rome to intervene. Highlighting that his family had been dutifully of service to Rome since the days of Pompey, Herod reminded the Senate how important it was to have an ally in Judea. Judea might be small and a relatively minor province, but it was geopolitically strategic, with close access to Alexandria and its vital grain shipments. Lose Judea, and Rome risked losing the key to keeping the people fed. With Antigonus on the throne and Parthia backing him up, the region was now decidedly hostile to Roman interests, and the Parthians could use Judea as a stepping stone to further threaten Roman interests, either directly or through their proxy. Not only did the area need to be returned fully to Roman control, but also the Romans needed a key ally in the area to look after their interests. Herod pleaded for Rome's muscle to push out Antigonus and restore the area to pro-Roman control. The Senate deliberated what to do. Clearly, they were impressed by Herod. They were swayed by his essential logic. To maintain their power in the region and to protect their territories, they needed to boot the Parthian puppet Antigonus. But even if they did so, they still had a small problem. Who would run the country? Hyrcanus was a perfectly willing collaborator, but he was weak, and his mutilation at the hands of his captors had rendered him unfit to resume the high priesthood. Herod and Phasael had made a good duo as governors, but Phasael was dead, and there was no going back to the three-headed rule that had governed Judea before Antigonus drove them out. The Senate preferred to deal with just one strong client anyway. In a surprise move, they decreed that Herod would be king of Judea and placed him directly on the throne. This move made sense from a Roman point of view. No input from other Judeans, no consideration from any other political dynamics, no worrying about the Sadducee versus Pharisee division. A snap of the fingers, and just like that, Herod was a king, a role not even held by Hyrcanus at the time of the Parthian intervention, and he was a Hasmonean. Herod was an Idumean, the son of a court retainer. He had no ties tracing his lineage back to the Maccabees. It was a surprising decision, quite the plot twist, but again, the Romans didn't care about Judean politics. The legitimacy of a Hasmonean meant nothing to them. They just wanted a firm hand on the reins, and Herod had proved to be reliably pro-Roman, less worried about any faction of Roman politics specifically and more focused on being an ally to Rome in general, regardless of what party or group was ascendant. Herod's father had hitched the family's wagon to Pompey a generation earlier, and now that move was paying dividends beyond anybody's wildest imagination. The person most surprised by this turn of events was Herod. He seems to have been in Rome with the narrow goal of mobilizing the Romans to intervene and drive off their shared rivals. Perhaps he hadn't even considered himself a viable candidate to be king. After all, his father and his brother had all served Rome as clients and representatives, but always in roles stretching from behind-the-scenes influencers to, regional governors. To be named Basileus, or king, was a very big promotion. This might mark the only time in Herod's colorful life and career when he seemed to have not been thinking in the most grandiose terms. In the more than 4 decades of life remaining to him, Herod would never again show such a lack of ambition. Newly sanctioned as king of Judea and friend of the Romans, the client king Herod headed back to his homeland. By 39 BCE, he was organizing an army and initiating a campaign to retake Judea. His strategy was clever. Knowing that the key to the country was Jerusalem, he reasoned that Antigonus would concentrate his forces in the capital. Rather than directly confront Antigonus in his strongest territory, Herod set about methodically reducing the countryside. In this, he echoed the grand strategy of the great rebel priest and general Judah Maccabee over a century earlier. With Antony having driven out the Parthians, Herod could operate in Judea with impunity. Over 39 and 38 BCE, Herod took back all the outlying areas, including Galilee, the territory over which he had been governor. It was by no means an easy campaign, and plenty of Galileans, remembering the brutality of his governorship, offered stiff resistance. But Herod was too strong and too determined to be denied. By the end of 38 BCE, Herod had reconquered all of Judea except for Jerusalem, cutting off and isolating Antigonus in the capital. In 37 BCE, and now backed by the might of a Roman army, Herod laid siege to Jerusalem itself. Antigonus held out as long as he could, and the siege dragged on for months. Antigonus could count on ferocious support from his partisans. Many saw him, not only as the rightful heir and ruler, but as independent from Rome. A significant number of the elites in Judean society seethed at Roman interference in their politics, and wanted to return Judea to a state of independence, ending the subservience to Rome and integration into their burgeoning empire. It didn't seem to bother them that the only reason they'd had this taste of self-control was their subservience to Parthia. Rome was the bigger enemy, and Herod was clearly Rome's guy, as evidenced by the fact that Rome itself had just decreed Herod to be king. Despite the fervent nature of the Antigonid partisanship, the combined might of Herod and Rome was just too much. Eventually, the Herodian forces broke into the city, through the walls of the temple, and captured Jerusalem. When the Romans broke through the defenses and poured into the city, they did what they did so often: looting, raping, pillaging. Horrified, Herod frantically tried to stop the violent sacking of Jerusalem, which he was only able to do by opening up his own coffers and bribing the Romans to stop. Antigonus was seized, bound in chains, and sent to Antioch for judgment at the hands of Mark Antony. Antony had Antigonus beheaded. We got no food, we got no job, our king's heads are falling off. This marked the first time in Rome's history that they directly executed a king. This ended the Hasmonean dynasty, which had lasted for more than a century and dated back to the Maccabees. But no one around could have quite known that at the time, as there were plenty of other Hasmoneans still around, many of whom longed for their family to retake their rightful place as Basileus of Judea. So in 37 BCE, with the Romans having chosen him as their go-to guy, Herod took control of the kingdom of Judea. It was quite an accomplishment, and an outcome that few could have predicted. But still, it was one thing for the Romans to look at Herod and see a king. It was another thing entirely for his fellow countrymen to consider him in the same light. He was long on ambition, but short on legitimacy. Herod, shrewd as he was, had already put in place the move that would go a long way toward shoring up his support. Either during the siege of Jerusalem or just after, Herod collected his fiancée from the family stronghold at Masada, and in 37 BCE, he wed Mariamne, now 17. He was twice her age, around 35 years old. As an aside, the views on age differences between brides and grooms were quite different in the ancient world. Today, a man in his mid-30s marrying a teenage bride is creepy, but there is nothing out of the ordinary as such matches in the ancient world, especially among the nobility and royalty. Even if anyone raised an eyebrow back then, Herod wouldn't have cared a lick, as Mariamne, through her Hasmonean lineage, brought with her a measure of regal legitimacy that he could never attain on his own, and that was priceless. Their kids would be of Hasmonean stock, fully legitimate royal successors. Now safely enthroned and strengthened by his marriage, Herod invited Hyrcanus to end his exile in Babylon and return to Judea. Unfit for the high priesthood due to his disfigurement, the former king and high priest was nonetheless treated with great respect and deference. Herod appointed Hyrcanus to key political positions and maintained the strong relationship between his family and Hyrcanus, showing the elder man tremendous respect, seating him at the place of honor at royal meals, and investing him with great political and moral authority. But the balanced power had shifted decidedly. In the past, the Herodians owed their positions and authority to Hyrcanus. Now Hyrcanus owed his position and status to Herod. Oh, how the turntables. Despite his marriage to Mariamne, the social acceptance of Herod remained a challenge for the upstart king. As mentioned previously, being Basileus was one thing, but little could match the status and prestige of the high priest. With Hyrcanus disfigured and Antigonus dead, the high priesthood was held by a non-Hasmonean, Anenelus. As long as the high priest owed their position to Herod, then all would be okay for the new king. Anenelus was appropriately differential. But there was another Hasmonean in the picture, and he, or more precisely, his mother, had big plans. The young boy was Aristobulus III, brother to Herod's new bride Mariamne. We've mentioned this before, but the all-in-the-family royal marriages can be tricky, so here is a quick recap. See if you can follow along. Aristobulus and Mariamne were the children of Alexandra and Alexander. Alexandra, the mom, was the daughter of Hyrcanus. Alexander, the dad, was the son of Aristobulus II. That made them first cousins, and they were both children and grandchildren of Hasmonean kings. Alexander didn't raise a single word to object to the rise of the upstart Herod, mostly because he died 10 years before all this happened. But Alexandra was very proud of her Hasmonean lineage. Her lineage on both sides was impeccable, and she bristled at her family's displacement in favor of this Idumean Nabatean upstart, even as she married her daughter off to him. She began to make moves to revitalize her family's position. As time will tell, Alexandra was every bit as cunning and ambitious as her son-in-law. In these machinations, Alexandra had a willing ally, the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the current pharaoh of Egypt. She herself was the descendant of a royal house with long roots. Her dynasty dated back to Ptolemy I, companion and general of Alexander the Great. In the bloody struggles called the Wars of the Diadochi, following the great conqueror's untimely demise, Ptolemy had seized Egypt and built his own powerful and obscenely wealthy kingdom, with its capital at Alexandria, which had been founded by and named for our old friend Alex himself some 3 centuries earlier. Cleopatra was the latest from this complicated family to lead Egypt. Of note, she was truly a remarkable person. Undoubtedly brilliant, she spoke as many as 8 languages. She was actually the first Ptolemaic pharaoh to speak Egyptian and to read hieroglyphs. She studied every field imaginable, from history and philosophy to medicine and zoology. Her education also included statecraft. She was raised to rule. She was refined, dignified, brilliant, and ambitious, one of the towering intellects of the ancient world. Like every other country in the Mediterranean, Egypt had been slowly pulled into the vortex of Roman politics for the past few decades. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had been a client of Pompey. That's why the Roman general fled to Egypt after his defeat at the hands of Julius Caesar. It was Cleopatra's brother/husband, Ptolemy XIII, that had miscalculated so gravely by ordering Pompey's assassination. As we've discussed, Caesar got involved in their civil war, sided with Cleopatra, barely survived with his own life, that survival thanks in large part to Herod's dad, Antipater. In these dramatic events, Caesar famously fell for the queen. Caesar and Cleopatra even had a child together, the boy history knows as Caesarion. Cleopatra's relationship with Rome was complicated. She did everything in her power to keep as much autonomy for her kingdom as possible. When Caesar died, she began a relationship with one of his successors, Mark Antony. At first, this was likely a practical step to ensure the security of her kingdom. In time, it seems as though the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra blossomed into genuine mutual love and devotion. Of course, we've met Antony many times before. Among other things, he helped drive the Parthians out of Roman territory as a response to their invasion in 40 BCE and supported Herod as he supplicated himself to the Roman Senate. Herod's appointment by Rome as king of Judea was in no small measure thanks to Antony's support. These two seemed to have genuine respect and admiration for one another. We might even call them friends. However, Antony's military intervention had come at a cost. After driving out the Parthians, he retained important territorial holdings that were central to Judea, including rich groves of balsam outside of Jericho used for important ritual incense. As smitten with her as Herod was with Mariamne, Antony gifted Cleopatra rich landholdings that had originally belonged to Judea, including those fragrant and highly lucrative balsam groves. Cleopatra, in turn, extorted an astronomical lease of 200 talents, which Herod paid. He had to rent back his own land at a massive fee under a flimsy pretext, just to get more cash in Cleopatra's pocket. This at a time when she was likely the richest person in the world. It's not surprising that Herod was wary of the Egyptian queen. Herod began to worry that she might slowly turn Antony against him. Herod's mother-in-law, Alexandra, in turn, was on friendly terms with Cleopatra, and she used her relationship with the queen to seek a better situation for her son by lobbying for Aristobulus to be appointed as high priest. Cleopatra took in the request and responded by suggesting that Alexandra should take her son and present themselves in front of Antony in order to make their request in person. This disturbed Herod, as he worried that Antony would be swayed to go a step further and install Aristobulus not just as high priest, but as basileus as well. But Antony did no such thing. He did, however, suggest to Herod that the young prince should be installed as high priest. Herod had nothing to gain by defying Antony's will. At the same time, having a full-blooded Hasmonean in the prestigious high priesthood posed a serious threat to Herod. He always struggled with acceptance of the Judean nobility and priestly classes. With a puppet in the high priesthood, Herod had mitigated the impact of some of this critique. But with an independent Hasmonean in this important role, Herod's concern may have been well justified. Herod was in a tough spot. He could not defy Antony. Rome was the source of his power, and he couldn't compromise that relationship. But having Aristobulus as a high priest created a genuine rival and threatened his throne. To complicate matters, the young Aristobulus had something Herod did not: the love and affection of the Judeans. In addition to being Hasmonean prince and having a claim to legitimacy that Herod could never have, he was handsome and charismatic. Herod's brother-in-law was a genuine threat, and so too was his mother-in-law. Alexandra chafed at her family's displacement, and through Aristobulus, she saw a path to the restoration of her family's rightful place on the throne of Judea. With deference to Antony, Herod acquiesced and removed Anenelus as high priest and allowed the Hasmonean Aristobulus to take over the role. He was likely 17 at the time, 1 year younger than his sister Mariamne. Herod was smitten with his young bride, but this didn't change how he felt about her brother. He decided the best way to respond to the threat posed by Aristobulus was to obsessively watch over every move the boy made. Herod set up a surveillance state that tracked every single thing the high priest did. What he did, who he talked to, where he went, who he went with. Everything was carefully observed and reported back to Herod. There is no evidence that Aristobulus was plotting any seizure of power, but evidence didn't matter. Herod's vivid imagination made the threat all too real. In short order, he decided to go a big step beyond surveillance. In 36 BCE, just a year after taking the throne, Herod whispered orders that Aristobulus was to be eliminated. The moment came at a banquet thrown for the young man by his mother at the Winter Palace in Jericho. This palace had long been in the Hasmonean family, but Herod had taken it over, and in one of his first major building projects, lavishly remodeled, expanded, and adorned the palace. It was a good place for a celebration, and the guests enjoyed the feast. As evening settled in, someone suggested that the party should cool off in the swimming pool within the palace complex. Now, Herod loved swimming pools. He would construct many of them, and this one was quite large, approximately 100 feet by 60 feet. At first, Aristobulus didn't join in, but Herod encouraged him to go for a swim and cool off from the heat of the day. What's it good in renovating a palace if you can't enjoy all of its amenities? Yielding to the pressure, in Aristobulus climbed, joining a group of young Herodian partisans. The teenagers splashed and dunked each other in the water. They raised such a commotion that no one noticed when some of the party seized Aristobulus and held him down underwater. The last scion of the Hasmoneans thrashed and flailed, but it was to no avail. He drowned in the pool, the act obscured by the creeping darkness of night and the noise made to mask the murder. Herod eliminated a rival and wiped out what was, either real or imagined, the first real threat to his throne. It certainly wouldn't be the last. It was a cruel act, state-sponsored murder. From a cynical political point of view, there is a cold logic to the action. On one hand, Herod eliminated a rival, and with it, the last true contender with a legitimate claim to the throne. On the other, he could look at Antony and Cleopatra and shrug. Tragic, isn't it, that Aristobulus managed to drown in the swimming pool? Gosh, such a pity. The claim of accidental drowning was laughable, but no one was going to say that out loud. To level accusations against Herod would likely have been a death sentence. Alexandra mourned her beloved son and quietly began a whisper campaign against her son-in-law. She began communicating with her friend Cleopatra more frequently, accusing Herod of murder. Cleopatra was furious, and she urged Antony to chastise Herod. But Antony and Herod had a long history, and instead, Antony called Herod to come make his case in person. This was another request that Herod couldn't refuse. He had no problem with making the journey to call on Antony, but he did worry about his wife. Mariamne was beautiful, and as a Hasmonean princess, an important part of his legitimacy. In part fueled by a possessive paranoia, and in part by a cynical calculation that his bride would be a great prize for a rival, Herod entrusted her to the care of an uncle. But before leaving, he gave a strange order. Should Antony kill Herod, the uncle, named Joseph, must kill Mariamne. If he couldn't have her, then no one else could. In a slip of the tongue that would come to have disastrous consequences, Joseph let this juicy tidbit spill to Mariamne and Alexandra. For his part, his trip to and presentation before Antony was mundane. Having explained himself in person and soothed any apprehension on the part of Antony, Herod made the trek back to Judea. But he arrived to find that many rumors and intrigues had swirled in his absence. Some said that he had been killed by Antony. When word of this alleged death reached Alexandria, she hatched a plot to take Mariamne to the Roman garrison and seek their protection, thus positioning themselves as likely successors to the Judean throne. Others, including Salome, Herod's sister, claimed that Mariamne had carried on an affair with Uncle Joseph. While Herod dismissed this, he did have Joseph executed on the grounds that if Joseph had given up the secret orders, then he must have gotten a little too cozy with the royal women he was supposed to chaperone. For good measure, he put Alexandra, his mother-in-law, under something akin to house arrest. But none of this drama dampened his fervent obsession with Mariamne. Despite Herod's murder of her brother and the hostility toward her mother, Mariamne showed no outward signs of discontent, and the couple had several children, with sons Alexander and Aristobulus being born in 35 and 31 BCE respectively, and two girls, Salampsio and Cypros, following thereafter. There may have been a fifth child, a boy who died in Rome while being raised and educated in the empire's capital. Records on this are a bit sketchy. Among all the ups and downs of his home life, Herod faced his first war as king of Judea. The adversary was the Nabateans. The roots of this conflict are obscure, and Nabatea seems an unlikely foe, given that Herod himself was half Nabatean, his mother, Cypros, being a Nabatean Arab princess. In his effort, Herod was at first supported, perhaps even encouraged, by Cleopatra, who encouraged Herod to plunder his neighbors. With her backing, Herod had great success. But somehow, as the war unfolded, Cleopatra's top general slipped out of Herod's camp and into Nabatea, bringing his extensive expertise and reinforcements, and together this force routed Herod. It's hard to tell what Cleopatra was up to in this course of events. At first, she helps Herod, then she works against him. Perhaps she only encouraged Herod's aggression as part of the plan to set him up for failure. Or maybe she just wanted to prevent him from growing too strong after his initial successes. For thousands of years, and I mean thousands of years, Egyptian rulers had seen the Levant as being firmly in their sphere of influence. Given Cleopatra's historical studies, it's reasonable to speculate that she wanted to weaken both Judea and Nabatea to ensure that Egypt's reach was long and its regional power unrivaled. It's also clear she didn't like Herod one bit, but it's really hard to tell what was happening here. Eventually, her general left town and Herod resumed the campaign, winning a major battle around 31 BCE. The conflict would flare up shortly thereafter, but again Herod crushed the Nabateans, and they wouldn't offer much more trouble for the next 2 decades. For their part, his Roman allies had bigger things to worry about. His friend Mark Antony had predictably fallen out with his on-again, off-again partner Octavian, this time for good. The causes of this civil war are long and complex and a bit out of scope for our episode, but suffice to say that things deteriorated quickly when the Second Triumvirate legally expired on the last day of 33 BCE. From that point forward, relations between the two sides crumbled, and before long, the Roman world was cast into another full-scale civil war, with Octavian and his loyal lieutenant Marcus Agrippa on the one side, and Mark Antony and his wife and partner Cleopatra on the other. In case you're wondering, Lepidus had been stripped of all of his powers years before after an ill-fated bid for power. Somehow, he managed to keep his head, literally, and he went into a comfortable semi-exile/retirement. Lepidus would live quietly all the way to 12 BCE, about 76 years of age, quite elderly for the day, and all the more remarkable that he survived the constant bloodshed to die of old age. Anyway, civil war was nothing new for the Romans, and for that matter, for their Judean clients. But Herod faced a choice. Which side should he back? Choose the right side, and the rewards could be considerable. Choose the wrong side, and the consequences threatened to be severe. There was potential upside in all of this. If Antony could be overthrown by his rival, then Herod could reclaim the territory he was leasing from Cleopatra at exorbitant rates and close the back channel his mother-in-law had used to undermine him. But Herod, for all his paranoia and ambition, also had a loyal streak. Antony had backed Herod steadily for years, even if Antony allowed Cleopatra to encroach in his territory and to his pocketbook. Besides, it was also the safer bet. If Vegas were around back then the odds would have heavily favored Antony and Cleopatra. They had more money, more resources to draw from, a more extensive network of clients to lean on, and more experience in warfare. For their part, Octavian and Agrippa, they were young, they lacked experience, and were still somewhat unknown. Herod gave Antony his support and, like the rest of the Mediterranean world, held his breath as events played out. But upsets do happen. The one thing no one could have predicted was the precocious genius of Marcus Agrippa. Only 32 years old at the time, in 31 BCE, he outmaneuvered and outfought the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra at the naval battle of Actium. Cleopatra fled the scene with the Egyptian treasury, and Antony skulked away to rejoin her in Egypt, abandoning their ships and troops in the heat of battle and leaving them to their fates. The force of Octavian and Agrippa moved too quickly, and Antony lost all heart. He and Cleopatra famously committed suicide. The civil war ended. Octavian seized the Egyptian treasury and territory. He toured the sites of the great capital, including visiting the tomb of Alexander the Great and accidentally knocking the nose off the corpse. He packed up and made for home, now solely in control of the Roman world. But before leaving, guided by the mantra that, quote, 2 Caesars is one too many, close quote, he made sure to track down and execute Caesarion, the young son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. This outcome was a mixed blessing for Herod. On one hand, with the overbearing Cleopatra gone, he might have a little room to operate. But he had also backed the losing side, and the Romans weren't always forgiving of enemies. Octavian, now firmly on his way to becoming the first Roman emperor, and with it the title by which most know him today, Augustus, was particularly cold-blooded and calculating. Herod knew that he needed to get in front of the situation. After Actium, but even before Antony and Cleopatra died in Alexandria, Herod packed up and left Judea to personally call on Octavian, who was at that time on the island of Rhodes. The civil war wasn't over, but the outcome seemed all but decided. Herod knew that if he wanted to sway Octavian, he would have to be decisive. He made arrangement for his sister and sons to stay in one royal stronghold and for his mother-in-law and wife to be housed in another. Once again, he left his wife in control of a trusted subordinate and again issued the secret order that should anything happen to Herod, the guard was to kill Mariamne and Alexandra and the kingdom be turned over to his sons, with his sister Salome to act as regent. This might seem a bit excessive, but from Herod's point of view, with his prior call on Antony and again in this supplication before Octavian, he was putting his life in danger. He had lived on the margins of acceptable behavior, and the Romans were always unpredictable. Antony had summarily executed Antigonus. If he'd killed one king with the snap of his fingers, then Octavian doing the same thing to a second wasn't out of the question. For his part, Octavian wasn't exactly known for his benevolence and generous spirit. For example, and as mentioned, the Second Triumvirate had liquidated thousands of political enemies upon seizing power. Herod made the calculation that the risk of handing himself over for judgment was less than the risk of waiting for the Romans to come calling. And when they had a score to settle, the Romans always came calling. It makes sense that Herod would contemplate that his own death was possible, but that doesn't quite explain why his wife's death would therefore become necessary. Perhaps he didn't trust that his sons would be given the kingdom. Or perhaps he was so possessive of the beautiful Mariamne that he was tortured by the thought of her falling into someone else's hands after he was gone. Probably it was both. She was young and clearly capable of having healthy children. If Herod were gone, it'd be easy enough for some upstart to marry her, kill off the sons that she had had with Herod, have ones of their own, and clear the way for their children to rule. Herod was always the most interesting combination of paranoia and pragmatism. When he got to Rhodes, Herod was able to secure an audience with the ascendant Octavian. Just as he had charmed the Roman Senate all those years ago, Herod managed to turn the cold heart of Octavian to his cause. Vowing loyalty and promising to defend Rome's interests, Herod convinced Octavian to allow him to stay on the Judean throne. He could also, paradoxically, point to his loyalty as an asset. It didn't matter that Herod had backed Antony. What mattered is that Herod was a steadfast partner. Of course, it probably didn't hurt that Herod also brought ungodly amounts of treasure to help seal the deal. This was money Octavian would need as he set to consolidate the sole power of the Roman world into his hand. So that, plus the realization that Rome really did need a strong ally on the Judean throne to keep open the link to the vital provinces of Syria and Egypt. Thus, confirmed on his throne, Herod headed back to Judea with a renewed commitment to look after the Roman interests in the area and the beginnings of something that would become a lifelong friendship between him and Augustus. This was an extremely complicated time for Herod. A lot of the maneuvering and fighting in the Roman Civil War and Herod's response to the shifting events had been going on while Herod had been dealing with the Nabatean War. That had ended in decisive victory for Herod. Still, Herod couldn't shake the feeling that someone within his camp had betrayed him and aided the Nabateans in their efforts. In particular, and for God only knows what reason, he cast a suspicious gaze on the aged Hyrcanus, the former king and high priest who had done so much to advance the Antipatrid family fortunes. It's hard to see what Hyrcanus would have had to gain from giving aid to the Nabateans. He owed his life and status to Herod, and mostly he seemed content to enjoy the trappings of rank and prestige. Most of the intrigues in which he had been embroiled in life had come at the instigation of others, especially Herod's father, Antipater, and yet Herod could just not quite shake the feeling that the old ally of his family had been conspiring against him. In a mark of his hasty reactions to perceived duplicity, Herod ordered that the aged Hyrcanus be seized and executed. The orders were carried out with delay, and just like that, another of the Hasmoneans was gone. Keep in mind, this was also his wife's grandfather. Being married to this guy was rough on the family. It's unsurprising that disaffection would take hold. Things began to unravel between the king and queen in the aftermath of Herod's trip to Rhodes. Once again, the royal women had managed to cozy up to their chaperone. They pulled out of the hapless guy that Herod had indeed, again, issued the secret contingency orders to have them killed in the event of his own death. This deeply unsettled Mariamne. Clearly, her husband didn't trust her, nor did he value her enough to consider her ability to outlive him. She began to grow cold and distant, refusing to sleep with him and denying affection in many other ways. She even accused him of murdering her brother, as well as her grandfather Hyrcanus. He remained fanatically obsessed with her, but the fanaticism grew darker and more paranoid. Salome, Herod's sister, had been suspicious of the Hasmonee in Alexandria and Mariamne since the time that Herod had gone to plead before Antony. Now, with the breach between Herod and Mariamne beginning to open, she saw an opportunity to vent her fury on her sister-in-law. Salome whispered in Herod's ear that Mariamne was plotting against him, that she planned to poison him, that she wanted him dead. Gripped by a combination of fear and heartbreak, Herod had one of Mariamne's retainers tortured for information. The poor guy knew nothing of the plot, but he did mention that the breach was a result of Herod's secret orders being divulged. Once again, the chaperone, this time a court retainer named Sohaemus, was summarily executed for his transgression. But this time, Herod didn't simply forgive his wife. The accumulated whispers had grown too loud, both those from Salome and those in his head. On the pretense of fairness, Herod had his beloved wife put on trial for treason. When she was found guilty, he ordered her execution. Herod, in his twisted way, was heartbroken. For all his paranoia, he was obsessive about Mariamne. Even though he was the one that ordered it, her death threw him into deep mourning. The grief-stricken king ordered that her body be embalmed in honey. He was said to go visit, to sit beside her corpse and talk to her for a long time after her death. This tragic turn of events tipped the always emotional Herod into deep and profound depression. He was overcome with a deep sadness. He was weighed down by the crushing weight of his grief. He struggled to eat, even to breathe. He lost his will to live, and the sources suggest that in this period he was frequently on the verge of death. Slowly, he clawed his way back to strength, physically and emotionally, but he emerged from his anguish as a changed man. He would never really trust anyone again. Always prone to paranoia, he devolved further into suspicion and fear. He also seems to have stopped caring about what the local Judean elites thought of him, in particular, those who eyed his Arab and Idumean background with derision. He also ceased to worry about holding any legitimacy through connection to the Hasmoneans. From this point forward, he was going to be fully his own man. Woe to anyone who posed a threat to or questioned the legitimacy of the king, real or imagined. Herod wasn't the only one heartbroken at the death of Mariamne. Alexandra, in her own way, was as devoted to her daughter as Herod had been. With the king now responsible for the death of both of her children, Alexandra was deeply grieved at the losses that had befallen her family. And lest we forget, Herod had also ordered the execution of her father, Hyrcanus. Whether intentionally or not, Herod was systematically eliminating all the Hasmoneans. Enough was enough. She was descended from bold leaders, rebels, revolutionaries, Maccabees. She resolved to act. Alexandra used Herod's grief as a pretext for an attempted coup. Herod was devastated at the death of Mariamne. He was inconsolable, clearly not present, distracted elsewhere, spending time alone with the corpse of his dead wife. Alexandra used this deep, sorrowful grief to attempt to organize a coup. She declared herself queen and accused Herod of mental instability. He was unfit to be king. If she hoped that people would rally to her banner and overthrow Herod, she miscalculated. She may have had the people and the nobility on her side, but Herod held tight to the reins of power. Alexander's coup was over before it started. He quickly reasserted control and in 29 BCE executed his mother-in-law. No such deference to her earthly remains as had been shown to her daughter was forthcoming. Herod's body count was starting to pile up, and he was just getting started. Part of why Alexander's plot had been doomed to fail was due to the nature of Herod's paranoia. By the time her coup flared up and flamed out, Herod had been king for more than a decade. It had taken him a few years to gain control of his territory, ridding himself of this enemy or that, but by 29 BCE, Herod had installed a robust network of spies and informants. There were eyes and ears everywhere. Every piece of gossip, every whisper, every furtive glance, it all made its way back to the king. He wallowed in rumor. He stewed. He plotted. He liquidated enemies, real and imagined. Even if someone wanted to make an attempt on his life, they would have to get through his retainer of bodyguards, which numbered in the thousands. He insulated and isolated himself, gathering up all manner of information and acting on all threats, both real and imagined. Even if Alexander's rebellion had many sympathizers, and it likely did, those sympathies remained buried deep in the hearts and minds of those that held them. But few, if any, spoke up, let alone acted. To act against Herod was to sign one's own death warrant. Few were willing to die for the cause. The sentiment of the people of Judea toward Herod is a matter of speculation. It is widely believed that he was deeply unpopular, loathed by the people, and especially the nobility. It seems reasonable to conclude that he was certainly feared by those closest to his power. If he could kill his uncle, his wife, his brother-in-law, his grandfather-in-law, his mother-in-law, and all these court retainers, then he could come for anyone. He was certainly ruthless and prone to paranoia. You did not want to get on his bad side. It could be fatal, and it often was. Herod built a true surveillance state. When he was first appointed king by the Romans a decade earlier, he seems to have been genuinely surprised by their decision. But once in control of the throne, he vowed to never let anything, even his closest family, get in the way of keeping it. As time would tell, he was far from being done turning against those closest to him. So this ominous foreshadowing seems like a good time to conclude this episode. But don't worry, we will have a lot more to say about Herod in the episodes to come. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we see what Herod does in the aftermath of the twin executions of his wife and mother-in-law and the elimination of any threats, real or imagined, to his unfettered power.